This is our next video lecture, an overview of the Civil War. Basically, the Civil War is between the United States and the Confederate States of America. There's certainly, a lot to talk about why they're seceding and who they are. They formed shortly after the Civil War. Of course, South Carolina, the Palmetto State, is the first one to secede. There's different interpretations of exactly why this happened. If you go back to the last lecture and look at the election map, you can see that the South did not vote for Lincoln. Certainly people felt like they were not going to be represented in the federal government, and then there was maybe not a point in being part of the United States. If you actually look at the sources, though, you can see that the people calling for secession are very much not the people. There was not a referendum in any of these states. It's very much the state government saying, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to secede, not be part of the United States. And this was certainly shocking. This had not happened before, but it was a long time coming when you look back to the rhetoric of the last decades. Certainly the idea of states' rights, preserving the right to have slaves and spread slavery was a really big thing, and that growing animosity between the Free Soilers, the actual abolitionists, and the South was very much irreconcilable. They want to be their own real nation, and their first real act to assert that was the attack at Fort Sumter. This is going to be really easy to mix up. We got Sumter, just do your best. So this was the first attack on U.S. soil, and it really showed that they were in rebellion, and this really started. On one side, you've got the United States. They have a lot of obvious advantages as a nation. Certainly they're, the nation in question. They have most of the industry, railroads, technology in the South. They have a lot of natural resources and a huge population. They also do a lot of agriculture there, which is going to allow them to both create a large army and supply that army. They have sizable disadvantages as well. They're fighting an offensive war to demand that these people stay. You could probably also make a pretty strong case that in some ways there was less emotional commitment to the war. They didn't start this war. A lot of people, especially recent immigrants, might not really have a strong feeling about whether the South should stay or not. The Confederacy is in a very different situation. After their governments decided that they were going to succeed and created their own government, they are fighting for the survival of their way of life and the survival of this nation that they've declared existed. They also do have the distinct advantages of having a lot of very talented military commanders. Think about those plantation families sending their sons off to Annapolis, the Naval Academy, that's in the South. Thinking about West Point, educations, a lot of those sons came from the South, and that's going to be a distinct advantage to their military. Disadvantages, they don't have a very diverse economy, which is going to hurt them. Most of the fighting is on their territory, which is certainly going to cause a lot of damage, and they have a smaller, especially free population, which is going to hurt them. Some of the battles that really define the war, certainly there's a lot more than we're going to go into, but the Battle of Bull Run is the first big one. It demoralized everybody. It really showed this was not going to be an easy war, especially for the Union. This was going to be a very long war. Shiloh is another one. It was fought in Tennessee, which is one of those crucial border states. There were horrible casualties on both sides, and again, this just showed that this was going to be a terrible, very protracted war. Antietam is important. Very similar in a lot of ways. It's fought in a border state. It's fought in Maryland, but this is the war that showed Europe they should stay out, and Britain rejects requests from the South to help them. That might seem strange to think about why any European nation like Britain would even bother to get involved, but think about who the South is exporting their cotton to. A lot of it's going to Britain, but after this, Britain decides, hey, that's not worth getting our military involved with. Gettysburg, certainly the other lecture, the Gettysburg Address one, speaks about this a little more in depth, but this is considered one of the main turning points in the war and sort of tips things in favor of the Union. It's also memorable because of the Gettysburg Address. There's an entire lecture on that. I encourage you to check out that video. Just don't you ever dare say that's where Lincoln lived, because that would be wildly inappropriate. Vicksburg certainly has a lot written about it. I would encourage you to check out all those resources as well. But this is one of the first battles where General Grant really proves himself, and it's a strategic victory for the North. On the exam, though, there's going to be a lot more about the politics than about the war, and the question of emancipation is certainly a big part of that. Certainly, when the North and the South are approaching this war in the beginning, it's not about slavery, it's about getting the South to stay in the United States. One of the main reasons they're not in the United States is because they felt like they were, under attack, and their economy was under attack because of the slavery issue. Even though it's so central to the Civil War, most people, even Lincoln, even Congress, don't expect that they're going to free every slave to end the war. Certainly, one of the reasons that they're not willing to broach the issue of slavery too directly, or certainly ending all slavery, is because there are slave states in the Union. Those key border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, are staying with the United States with the assumption that they will be allowed to continue having slaves. Is it the absolute cornerstone of their economies? No, but it is something that they and their legislators would really like to keep and expect to keep. Abolitionists are still there. They're pressuring the government, but they're not the leading voice in any way. One of the leading voices that actually does start to affect what's going on with abolition are actually military commanders in the Union. Certainly, as the war progresses, a lot of the fighting is on Southern soil, so as slaves start to flee their owners because they know the Union's close, or the Union actually takes over a plantation, and slaves are, now under control of a different force. A lot of them want to join the military. They want to bring family members with them who might not be able to participate but could help in another way. And you've got all these former slaves who say, hey, we'll cook, we'll do service jobs with the military. The Union has to figure out what to do with them. And they recognize that if they have these slaves under their control, if they can help the Union Army in some way, they're not helping the Confederate Army in the way that, hey, if they can, take care of the uniforms, do service jobs, dig latrines, cook for this army, they're not doing those jobs for the other army, and that they're not going to be a threat in that way. It could also serve to demoralize the Confederates if they're freeing the slaves. That could be another positive thing for the Union. This is not something that Lincoln buys into readily. Very important quote from Lincoln in his private writing: my paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I would do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. This quote takes some thought to interpret. Does it mean he doesn't want to free the slaves? Well, not really. Does it mean he really wants to free the slaves? It also definitely doesn't mean that. But it does show you where his priorities lie, in that he sees freeing slaves or retaining slavery as something that can help him achieve the ultimate goal of defeating the Confederate States and keeping them in the United States. Certainly there's a lot of discussion about his personal views, but ultimately he is the President of the United States, he is a politician, and he's willing to make compromises. You can see that by his willingness to let the border states retain slavery. You can see that by other actions. Certainly right before the secession, he was willing to make several compromises that never came to fruition, but he was willing to, for example, give up any attempt by the federal government to end slavery where it already existed. Those sorts of things show that he was willing to compromise about anything but the Union. Ultimately, though, he does sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which is one of his main accomplishments. If you ask a person on the street what they know about Lincoln, they'd say that he freed the slaves. That didn't occur until 1863, and a lot of that's urging from not just abolitionists, but those Union commanders who say, hey, this would demoralize the South and weaken them, and it would only help the Union. It'd help the former slaves, but it would help the Union. It is important, though, that you don't overestimate what this does. This was important because it ended slavery in Confederate states, in the states that were currently in rebellion against the federal government. That means not the border states. There aren't any slaves in the northern states, but certainly people in the United States still, in Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Maryland, they still have slaves, and this would not affect them at all. A lot of people, certainly abolitionists, were pleased, but a lot of them would have liked a complete abolition of slavery. Some people could care less, certainly free soilers. Like this, there would be more competition for free labor in the South, but in a way, this doesn't really do much. Does the federal government have authority over the Confederate States? Not according to Jefferson Davis and the government of the CSA, right? This is going to be tough to enforce. Another thing that's tough to enforce is the draft. There's a draft in the North and the South to get enough eligible soldiers. There's also a lot of controversy over the draft. Certainly, if you read a lot of Howard Zinn, if you want to check out those sections of People's History of the United States, there's quite a bit in that type of writing about how it really disadvantaged the poor. Wealthier people were able to pay for a replacement, and so they wouldn't necessarily see themselves or their sons actually drafted into very, very dangerous military service. There were a lot of protests about the drafts from people who couldn't afford a replacement, like poorer immigrants in New York, cities like that. The anger is not necessarily all directed towards the government. Certainly a lot of it is sort of directed towards the actual executors of the draft, but also some of the anger is directed towards African Americans. It gets to the point where a lot of people, especially the recent white immigrants, start to see them as the reason for the war, especially post-Emancipation Proclamation, and there's a lot of violence directed towards African American communities in places like New York and bigger cities, Philadelphia. That is also a result of the draft riots. There's also some conflict in the South, but there's a little bit of a different way of looking at the war. Certainly as a defensive war in the South, there's a lot less resistance in that way. Here you can see some contemporary art of the time. This would have been published in periodicals. There was photography, but a lot of the news was still communicated through very skillful engravings such as these. Another big event of the war is Sherman's March to the Sea, especially for my Gone with the Wind fans out there. This was basically total war on the South. General Sherman decided he was going to practice a scorched earth policy, just destroy the South with no regard for civilians. That certainly sent a clear message and created a lot of animosity. Another big issue were bread riots in the South. Certainly as the war progressed, the South is getting poorer and more desperate. A lot of the fighting is in the South, whether it's something as dramatic as Sherman's March or a more traditional battle. People's homes and property are destroyed. People are forced to become refugees. Increasing numbers of families have their sole provider or perhaps all the men in the house gone because of the war or perhaps even dead. Overwhelmingly, there are food shortages in the South. Families are unable to provide for themselves with multiple family members missing or dead. Inflation is rampant in the Southern currency, and a lot of people aren't able to afford to buy what they need. And you end up having situations where women and families end up looting stores, looting the Confederate supplies, because certainly they are able to, take what they need. And as these events become more frequent, they're going to weaken support for the military. Women were involved not just as rioters, but as spies, nurses. This is one of the first wars with women nurses in some capacity, and certainly taking over for their husbands in their absence. This isn't enough, though, and ultimately the South does surrender. Their own economy is in ruins at this point. And they've been fighting a defensive war for quite a while. They've been demoralized by Sherman's March, bread riots, things like that. Certainly freeing many slaves in the South did not help their economic situation or the morale. And ultimately, in April of 1865, they captured Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederate States. And General Lee agrees to meet with the Union. While they're on the retreat, they surrender and negotiate a peace agreement at the Appomattox Courthouse. This is picture here is a dramatization of what happened to the Appomattox Courthouse, and ultimately that ends the white fighting and ends the war. Now they have to figure out what they're going to do with a South that is largely in ruins, with a nation that has grown quite a bit of animosity towards each other. Farms and homes are ruined. A lot of people are displaced, both the slave population and the white population. Tons of men are dead, young men who would have been head of household. It's going to be tough. Let's do some review questions. So I would encourage you to read through, Think about it, pause it, and then we'll talk through some answers together so you can see if we see these questions in the same way. Certainly for the first one, if you just, pop it back to one of those initial slides, the advantages and disadvantages of the Confederates are pretty clear cut. The Union has population, they have economic and technological advantages. They're also the more well-established nation. They would think they'd be able to maybe get some help from Europe. They don't end up getting it, but they don't end up needing it. The South has the advantage of fighting on their home turf, having better military leadership, and they're fighting for survival, which is pretty tough. Um, for question 3, how and why did Lincoln free the slaves? That is a little more debatable. Certainly, we haven't gotten to the actual end of all slavery, but we've got the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. Ultimately, it's a move to try to keep the Union together and end the war. Freeing slaves in the South only would keep the border states in the Union, but freeing slaves in the Confederate States would demoralize them, put them at an economic disadvantage, and allow slaves to participate, or freed slaves to participate on the Union side. Women also participate in the war, nursing, spying, helping a little bit, and certainly running their homes and families in the absence of their husbands is one of the main things they do. They also weaken the Confederate cause by participating in bread riots and other unrest during the war. One specific battle and why it was significant. Probably your top choices would be Antietam because it encouraged Europe to stay out, or Gettysburg because it was a turning point for the Union and that lovely speech. The Confederate surrender, ultimately, they're weakened by all those battles. Sherman's march is a huge demoralizer, so is the Emancipation Proclamation, and Appomattox Courthouse, 1865.